May 12, 1945. The train slowed with a shudder, iron wheels screeching against the rails, and the women inside leaned forward, their faces pale beneath grime. They had been told 1,000 things about what awaited them, rumors whispered in barracks, propaganda shouted by officers desperate to keep morale afloat in a collapsing Reich. Some believed they would be lined up and shot, others that they would be thrown into mines as slave labor, and nearly all of them feared violation and starvation. Their uniforms were no longer pressed, their boots cracked, their hair tied in makeshift knots. They were soldiers without weapons, auxiliaries without a war, women without a homeland. The train doors groaned open, and for the first time since the surrender, air that did not reek of smoke and steel rushed in. One woman, she might have been 24, her sharp cheekbones etched deeper by hunger, stepped down first. She clutched her coat tighter around her, as if the gesture alone could armor her against humiliation. All around her, the land was quiet, flat, impossibly clean. Wooden fences stretched into the distance. Barbed wire gleamed in the sunlight, precise and geometric, but there was no shouting, no snarling dogs. American guards in neat uniforms waited with a calm detachment, their rifles held more like tools than threat. The silence itself was unnerving. She braced herself for cruelty. And then it came, the smell. It drifted on the breeze like a ghost of another world, warm, greasy, unmistakably rich. Bacon, sizzling. She froze, as did the women behind her. It was impossible, obscene even. Bacon was a word from memory, from mornings before rationing, from kitchens where fathers still came home with pay and children still played without sirens overhead. To smell it here, at the edge of captivity, was like hearing laughter in a graveyard. Her stomach twisted in rebellion against its own emptiness. She remembered the last meal she had eaten in Germany, a thin broth stretched with turnips and stale bread that crumbled to dust. She had eaten it quickly, knowing her younger brother, if he were still alive somewhere in the rubble of Leipzig, might not have even that. And here, the Americans were cooking pork for prisoners? She felt dizzy with anger, shame, and a strange, reluctant yearning. The guards gestured for them to move into lines. Their voices were firm but not cruel, and one even attempted a broken phrase in German. Bitte schnell. The women obeyed, each step accompanied by the growing scent of breakfast. For some, it was unbearable. One woman muttered under her breath, cursing the Americans for mocking them with such luxury. Another began to weep silently, hands trembling against her skirt. Yet for all their fear, none could stop inhaling. The smell became a magnet, pulling memory and hunger into one bewildering sensation. Inside the camp, the reality unfolded with an almost theatrical strangeness. The barracks were wooden, sturdy, with straw mattresses lined neatly in rows. Windows let in sunlight. Buckets of water stood ready for washing. It was no palace, but compared to the basements and burned-out buildings many of them had last called home, it looked almost deliberate in its order. One woman whispered that it reminded her of boarding school, and though her tone was bitter, the words carried a dangerous seed of comfort. The 24-year-old found herself staring at a mess hall where smoke rose from chimneys and, through open doors, she caught glimpses of trays being set with plates. Not tin cups or slop buckets, but plates. Her throat tightened. She had expected to be herded, cursed, stripped of dignity. Instead, there was a quiet efficiency, a discipline that did not lean on cruelty. She did not trust it. None of them did. It had to be a trap, a performance, a softening before the lash. When at last they were marched into the hall, the sound hit them first, the crackle and hiss of fat on iron pans. Soldiers in aprons, yes, soldiers in aprons, stood at long counters, turning strips of bacon with metal tongs. The air shimmered with the heat of it, with salt and smoke and something almost musical in its ordinariness. The women shuffled forward, eyes darting, unable to reconcile their dread with the absurdity of the scene. Plates were handed to them. On those plates lay bread, potatoes, and to their astonishment, a strip or two of bacon. The 24-year-old stared down at hers, hand trembling. She thought of her mother, who had died in an air raid 2 winters ago, clutching a photo of her father who had never returned from the Russian front. She thought of the children she had seen begging in the streets of Dresden, skeletal hands reaching for scraps of coal. And now here, in enemy hands, she was offered bacon. Her chest ached with confusion. She wanted to refuse, to spit in defiance, to prove she was not so easily broken. But her body betrayed her. She raised the strip to her lips and bit. The taste was overwhelming. Salt, fat, warmth. It filled her mouth with memory and shame and relief so fierce it felt like grief. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and unbidden. She ate quickly, almost desperately, before reason could return. Around her, others did the same. Some laughed through their tears. Some chewed slowly, reverently, as if afraid the food would vanish. Others pushed it aside, unable to reconcile their pride with their hunger. But the room, for a few moments, was quiet except for the sound of chewing. One American guard leaned against the doorway, watching. He was perhaps 30, his uniform pressed, his face impassive. But when one of the women looked up, their eyes met, and he gave the smallest shrug, as if to say, "It's just breakfast." That shrug was more dangerous than any weapon. It suggested a world where enemies were not monsters, where captors could offer kindness. It cracked something deep inside the mythology these women had been fed. When the meal ended, the women were led back to their quarters. The 24-year-old lay down on her bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling. The taste still lingered on her tongue. She felt heavier and lighter at once, as though a great weight had been shifted but not removed. She did not know if she could trust the Americans, if this was generosity or strategy, but she knew one thing with certainty. Her understanding of the enemy had changed in a single meal. That night, as silence settled over the camp, she listened to the faint sound of guards patrolling outside. No shouts, no dogs. Only the steady rhythm of boots on soil. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come easily. The bacon had filled her stomach, but it had also unsettled her mind. If the enemy was capable of this, of order, of nourishment, even of something like mercy, then what else might she learn in captivity? The question burned hotter than hunger. And as dawn approached, the scent returned faintly, carried through the camp by the morning wind. She breathed it in, knowing that the war she had entered now was no longer about armies or borders, but about belief. She had been taught to expect cruelty. Instead, she had been met with bacon. It was not forgiveness, not friendship, but it was something far more dangerous to her certainties. It was proof of another reality. And the most unsettling truth of all was this: breakfast was only the beginning. The women soon learned that the greatest war inside the camp was not fought with rifles or fists, but with ideas that gnawed at the edges of everything they had been told. 4 years they had lived beneath the drumbeat of propaganda. Posters had screamed of American cruelty, of men who were said to be little more than mercenaries driven by greed. The radio had painted pictures of savages in uniform, men who would burn, humiliate, and desecrate any German unlucky enough to fall into their hands. Even the women who worked in offices or signal towers, far from the front, had carried those images with them like armor. They expected a brutality that would at least make sense of their fear. But the first weeks inside the camp made those images falter. The Americans spoke little German, yet their tone was measured, their discipline unshaken. Orders came short, clipped, but without venom. Guards treated the women as a responsibility rather than prey. Instead of hunger, there were regular meals. Instead of filth, there was soap and water. Instead of degradation, there was a strict adherence to routine. Each discovery unsettled them more than any shouted insult could have done. The 24-year-old found herself haunted by the contrast. She remembered the lectures in training halls where officers swore that capture meant a fate worse than death. She remembered the whispered warnings from older women who claimed the Americans carried knives for sport, that they laughed while cutting throat. Now she walked past orderly kitchens where cooks in aprons stirred vats of potatoes, their faces bored rather than cruel. She smelled coffee, Real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute she had known for years, and she heard the scrape of metal trays. She did not know which was more difficult, the hunger in her belly or the war raging in her mind. Propaganda had been her compass, and now the needle spun wildly. The others felt it too. At night, lying on thin mattresses, they spoke in hushed tones, weighing rumor against reality. One woman admitted she had feared rape the moment they stepped from the train, yet not a single guard had touched her. Another confessed she could not stop staring at the bread, white, soft, untainted by sawdust. Bread was supposed to be scarce everywhere, yet here it appeared in baskets, replenished without drama. To admit relief felt dangerous, almost treasonous to their suffering families back home. Still, the evidence was undeniable. The camp's order was deliberate, almost theatrical in its normalcy. Roll call at dawn. Work assignments for some, light duties for others. Inspections, not with whips or fists, but with checklists. The guards themselves seemed oddly young, barely older than the prisoners, their faces smooth, their boots shined. They stood with a confidence that came not from shouting but from certainty. For the German women, who had lived years in a world of scarcity and fear, that certainty was as alien as it was infuriating. The 24-year-old began to notice details that gnawed at her. She watched a guard share a cigarette with another, laughing quietly, as though the war were a distant nuisance rather than a shattering of nations. She heard music drift faintly from a gramophone in the officers' quarters, jazzy, playful, utterly indifferent to defeat or victory. She watched as food waste was carried out from the kitchens, scraps of bacon fat tossed aside, and her chest tightened at the thought of children in Hamburg or Leipzig who would have fought each other for those scraps. The cruelty was not in blows or hunger, but in the unbearable proof that the enemy could afford abundance while her people starved. There were moments of irony so sharp they almost bled. Once, as the women lined up for their midday meal, a guard tried to pronounce a German phrase. He mangled it so thoroughly that laughter burst from several throats before shame sealed them again. The guard only grinned, unbothered. To laugh at an American and survive, that in itself felt like a fracture in the world they had known. Another time, a woman dropped her tray, and a young American bent down to help her gather the mess. He did not sneer. He simply shrugged, muttered something in his own language, and returned to his post. She stood frozen, as if she had glimpsed a ghost of a world where kindness could cross wire fences. Yet suspicion lingered. Surely, they told themselves, this was temporary. Surely the cruelty would come later, after their defenses had softened. Some refused to eat the bacon, tearing it into pieces and leaving it untouched, as if to prove they would not be deceived. Others hoarded bread, slipping crusts into hidden pockets in case the abundance vanished. The 24-year-old tried to balance pride with survival, telling herself that to accept food was not to accept defeat. Still, each bite tasted of betrayal, both of the regime that had lied to her and of the civilians still starving across Germany. At night, the camp's lights glowed steady against the dark. Beyond the wire lay a continent in ruins, yet inside the fence there was order, routine, even safety. It was a paradox they could not untangle. Letters home, when allowed, were written carefully, sparing details, afraid of disbelief. Who would understand if they wrote, "We are eating better here than you are outside"? It would sound like treason, or madness, or both. Yet it was true. The Americans themselves seemed almost oblivious to the effect they created. For them, perhaps, feeding prisoners well was simply a matter of policy, a line in the Geneva Convention. For the women, it was a revelation that twisted the knife of doubt deeper. If their captors obeyed rules of fairness, if their captors offered food and shelter, then the image of America as a barbaric enemy crumbled. And if that image crumbled, what else had been a lie? The 24-year-old found herself thinking of her brother again. Had he died clinging to the belief that Americans were monsters? Had he gone to his grave fighting phantoms while she now ate their food and slept under their watch? The thought hollowed her chest. She could not admit it aloud, not even to the women beside her. But already, the war inside her mind was louder than the one she had left behind. And so the days passed, each meal another reminder that the old world was gone. The bacon became more than food. It was a weapon, a symbol, a challenge. It forced them to question not only the enemy but themselves. Some hardened further, swearing never to bend, refusing to smile no matter how orderly the camp became. Others softened, hesitantly, realizing that survival demanded more than defiance. The 24-year-old wavered between the two, torn by hunger and pride, shame and relief. One evening, as the sun sank beyond the wire, she sat alone, watching smoke curl from the kitchen chimneys. The scent of supper drifted across the yard, bacon again, mingling with potatoes and bread. She closed her eyes, letting the smell wash over her, and whispered a name she had not spoken since the bombing of Leipzig. Her brother's name. For the first time, she felt the truth pressing against her like a blade. Perhaps the greatest cruelty was not that the Americans beat them, but that they didn't. And somewhere in that unsettling kindness lay a lesson she was not yet ready to face. When the bell rang for the next meal, she rose with the others, stomach tightening. But what awaited them in the days ahead would not only challenge their hunger. It would confront their very beliefs, for the Americans were preparing something even more dangerous than bacon: ideas. The mornings began with the clang of the bell and the scrape of boots across the yard, but soon another sound seeped into the rhythm of camp life. The murmur of voices bent over books, the scratch of pencils against paper, the halting cadence of English words forced from German tongues. The Americans had not been content with feeding their prisoners. They wanted to teach them. At first, the women laughed bitterly when they heard the rumor. Lessons? Behind barbed wire? It seemed absurd, another trick to weaken their pride. But then the guards unlocked a long hut, cleared space, and set wooden benches in rows. A chalkboard appeared, scuffed but serviceable. Boxes of books followed, many with pages yellowed by years, others still smelling of fresh ink. What had begun with bacon was now continuing with sentences. The 24-year-old entered the classroom reluctantly, clutching her arms across her chest as though to shield herself. Around her, the other women shuffled with equal suspicion, their eyes darting toward the blackboard where an American sergeant had scrawled a single word in chalk: freedom. He underlined it twice, then smiled as though the meaning itself were nourishment. The women exchanged glances, uneasy, wary of what such a word demanded of them. The lessons began simply, with English phrases that twisted clumsily in German mouth. "Good morning. How are you? My name is—" The sergeant exaggerated his pronunciation, his voice almost playful, coaxing them to repeat. Some muttered the words with clenched jaws, others giggled at their own mistakes. The 24-year-old kept her face stern, but when she whispered the words, she felt them move strangely on her tongue, lighter than the guttural weight of her own language. It unsettled her. Beyond vocabulary, the Americans introduced films. One afternoon, the women were herded into the mess hall where a projector rattled to life. The screen flickered with images of ruined cities, corpses in striped uniforms, emaciated figures stumbling through liberation gates. The women stared in silence, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. Some whispered denials, others turned away. The 24-year-old felt her stomach knot. She had believed, or had wanted to believe, that such stories were exaggerated. Yet the camera did not flinch. The truth unspooled before them, grainy but undeniable. The bacon had been their first shock. This was their second, far darker. The Americans did not shout at them, did not force confessions. They simply let the images linger in the women's minds. Then they returned to their lessons, to their books, as if to say, "The world you believed in has ended, now learn the language of another." Some women resisted more fiercely after the films, retreating into silence. Others leaned forward, hungry not only for food but for knowledge, as though education itself were a ladder out of the rubble of their old lives. Statistics filtered into their days like background noise. Over 370,000 German POWs were held by the United States, thousands of them women, scattered across Europe and America. Many camps had libraries stocked with novels, histories, even poetry. To the women who had watched books burned in public squares only a few years earlier, this sudden abundance of words was both bewildering and intoxicating. The 24-year-old picked up a battered copy of Huckleberry Finn. She did not understand all of it, but the rhythm of the sentences carried her, the mischievous freedom of the boy's journey strange and irresistible. She read in secret at night, hiding the book beneath her blanket, as if it were contraband rather than a gift. Not every lesson was gentle. An American officer once asked the class to write about their childhoods. In English if possible, in German if not. The women bent over their papers, scratching memories of farms, cities, mothers baking bread, fathers returning from work, school days now blurred by war. When the officer collected the pages, he read some aloud, his voice even, his accent heavy. The 24-year-old's story was among them. She heard her own words, halting and imperfect, carried back to her in the enemy's voice. For a moment she felt stripped bare. And yet, in that exposure, there was something unexpected. She realized the Americans were not mocking, but listening. Humor crept in at odd moments. Once, during an English drill, the sergeant tried to teach the word, bacon. The room erupted in laughter before he even finished writing the letters. The women exchanged knowing looks, their shoulders shaking. For a few moments, the barbed wire melted away and the absurdity of it all, the enemy teaching them to name the very food that had unsettled their souls, was too much to contain. The sergeant grinned, chalk dust on his fingers, and let the laughter run its course. Still, tension underpinned everything. Each lesson was a reminder that the Americans were not merely feeding their bodies but reshaping their minds. The 24-year-old wrestled with guilt whenever she found herself enjoying the lessons. She thought of her brother, buried beneath rubble or mud, who would never read an American book, who would never hear jazz from a gramophone. She thought of her mother, who had died believing that victory was still possible. Was she betraying them by sitting on a bench, repeating foreign words, letting herself be moved by stories and songs? Yet the alternative, to close her ears, to retreat into silence, felt like death of another kind. The camp newspapers, written by prisoners under supervision, became another battlefield. Articles debated politics, philosophy, the meaning of democracy. The women read cautiously, their fingers smudged with ink, their eyes widened by ideas once forbidden. To think, to question, even to doubt, these acts became small rebellions against the past. Some tore the papers to shreds after reading, afraid of what the words might make them feel. Others folded them neatly, tucking them away like relics. Day by day, the 24-year-old felt herself drawn into the quiet revolution of learning. She began to greet guards in English, testing the phrases on her tongue. She lingered by the library hut, running her fingers along spines. She found herself humming a tune from a film reel, though she quickly silenced it when others glared. It was as though the wire fences no longer confined her body alone, but her beliefs as well, and each lesson cut a tiny hole through which another possibility leaked. But the lessons were not without pain. When another reel was shown, this time of American soldiers distributing food to liberated villages, she felt a hollow ache. She remembered German children clawing for scraps, her own gnawing hunger on the long march to captivity. She realized that while she ate bacon behind barbed wire, her people starved outside it. The contradiction tore at her, leaving her restless. The Americans did not press for gratitude. They did not ask for loyalty. They simply continued, day after day, to feed, to teach, to show. It was an unrelenting strategy, more patient than any whip, more unsettling than any blow. The 24-year-old began to understand that their greatest weapon was not their rifles, but their certainty that knowledge itself could undo the chains of the past. One evening, as the sun bled red across the yard, she lingered outside the classroom hut. In her hands was a notebook filled with her clumsy English sentences, her handwriting shaky but determined. She looked up at the barbed wire, its edges glowing in the last light. Beyond lay ruins she could barely imagine returning to. Inside lay lessons she could not yet admit she wanted. For the first time, she wondered not what the Americans would do to her, but what they were already doing inside her. And when the bell rang again, calling them back to the hut for another lesson, she hesitated. Her feet felt heavy, torn between defiance and curiosity. But as she stepped forward, she realized the war had shifted once more. No longer a battle of guns, nor even of propaganda, it was now a battle for her very imagination. And the next thing the Americans planned to show them would cut deeper than language or book. The gates opened with the same metallic groan that had once swallowed them whole, only now it released them into a world they scarcely recognized. Months, some even years, had passed behind wire, and the women who stepped out were not the same as those who had first inhaled the scent of bacon with disbelief and suspicion. The 24-year-old adjusted the small bundle she carried. Some clothes, a notebook filled with halting English phrases, a book left behind by a kind guard, and tried to brace herself. She had survived captivity, but survival outside the fence felt less certain. The train that carried them back toward Germany was crowded, rattling across landscapes scarred with silence. Villages lay flattened, chimneys rising like broken teeth from ash. Bridges hung twisted over rivers, their steel skeletons catching the sun. The women pressed their faces to the glass, searching for familiarity and finding only wreckage. One whispered that the Americans had treated them better than their own bombed-out cities ever would. Another muttered that perhaps captivity had been mercy disguised. No one argued. Their thoughts were heavy with images of meals eaten in relative order while, beyond the ocean, their families had queued for hours for turnips and black bread. When the train stopped, the 24-year-old disembarked into chaos. Crowds surged, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. Children clung to mothers' skirts, their cheeks sunken, their voices small with hunger. She stood still, heart pounding, overwhelmed by the cacophony of need. For a moment she longed for the regimented lines of the camp, the certainty of meals, the predictability of bells. Shame pierced her at the thought. Freedom was supposed to taste sweet. Instead, it tasted of ash and absence. Her hometown was gone. Where once had stood neat rows of apartments, now only rubble sprawled, bricks scattered like bones. She found the street where her family's home had been, only to discover it flattened. A neighbor, limping and gray-haired, told her brother had never returned, her father had died at Stalingrad, her mother crushed beneath beams during an air raid. The words landed without ceremony, yet they hollowed her chest as if struck by artillery. She stood amid the ruins, clutching her bundle, the scent of bacon from memory rising cruelly in her nostrils. To have been fed so well while her bloodline starved, was that survival or betrayal? The days that followed were a strange limbo. She lodged with distant relatives who eyed her with suspicion. They had suffered hunger, cold, and bombardment. She had been a prisoner, yet she had eaten. Her cheeks carried color, her frame more solid than theirs. One relative asked sharply, "What did you give the Americans in return?" She could not answer. How could she explain that survival had been offered in the form of order, meals, even books, without barter or humiliation? Her silence only deepened their mistrust. On the streets, she heard mutterings about returnees. Some claimed the Americans had brainwashed them. Others sneered that they had grown fat in captivity. Children stared at her, their eyes resentful, their bellies swollen with malnutrition. She avoided looking at them, for each glance carried the weight of accusation. At night, she lay awake, hearing her relatives shift restlessly, wondering if they resented her presence, if they believed she carried shame disguised as strength. Yet in the quiet, the lessons returned to her. She remembered the chalkboard word, freedom, and the films that had seared her illusions. She remembered the pages of Huckleberry Finn, the reckless joy of a boy on a raft, the audacity of a story unbound by fear. These memories clashed with the ruin around her. The Germany she had come home to was not only destroyed in stone but in spirit. Neighbors muttered about blame, about revenge, about betrayal. The 24-year-old listened, but inside her, another voice grew louder, one she had first heard in the classroom hut. Still, guilt shadowed her. Each time she smelled food cooking, thin cabbage soup, burnt barley coffee, her mind betrayed her with a memory of bacon sizzling in an American pan. The contrast was unbearable. She wanted to share it, to tell someone how surreal it had been, but she knew how it would sound. Boastful, ungrateful, treasonous. And so she kept it locked inside, the taste of bacon becoming not just memory but secret, a burden too heavy to confess. One afternoon, she passed a crowd gathered around a truck where aid workers handed out tins of food. Children scrambled, women stretched out thin arms. She stood at the edge, clutching her bundle, until a man in a foreign uniform handed her a can. She stared at the label, American. The sight made her throat tighten. The war was over, yet here again the enemy fed her people. She wanted to scream, to throw the can into the rubble, but her hands would not release it. She carried it home, where her relatives opened it greedily, scraping the contents into a pot, praising the Americans' abundance. She said nothing, but inside something shifted. The enemy had fed her once in captivity. Now they fed her people in ruin. The pattern could not be ignored. As weeks passed, she began to write in her notebook again. Clumsy English sentences, scraps of memory, questions she could not silence. Sometimes she wrote about her brother, sometimes about her mother, but often about the camp. The smell of bacon, the silence of the guards, the chalk dust on the sergeant's fingers. Her relatives caught her once, frowning at the foreign words. Why waste ink on their language? They asked. She lowered her eyes, but in her heart she knew the answer, because it connected her to a world that had not been reduced to rubble. Slowly, she realized that captivity had not ended at the gate. It lived inside her, in the conflict between memory and reality, between propaganda and experience. She was free in body but bound in thought, torn between loyalty to the dead and the undeniable truth of what she had seen. The bacon, the books, the films, they had not only filled her but changed her. She could not return to ignorance, no matter how much she wished to. One evening, she walked again to the ruins of her street. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across broken brick. She sat on a stone, opened her notebook, and wrote a single sentence in English. I am still alive. The words looked fragile on the page, yet they felt stronger than any uniform she had worn. She closed the book, pressing it against her chest, and let the silence settle. The taste of bacon lingered, no longer just food but symbol, both gift and curse. It had been proof of a world beyond the barbed wire, a world where enemies fed instead of starved, where words replaced whips, where books replaced commands. It was not mercy, not forgiveness, but something more dangerous, possibility. And as she stared at the ruins of her city, she realized that survival was not the end of her war. It was the beginning of another, one fought not with weapons but with memory, guilt, and the fragile hope that perhaps humanity could still be rebuilt from ashes. She rose, tucking the notebook under her arm, her steps slow but deliberate. The streets around her echoed with hunger and bitterness, yet inside her, the sizzling echo of bacon refused to die. It whispered of contradictions, of truths that unsettled, of futures that might yet be written. And as night fell, she understood with a clarity both terrifying and liberating. The war had ended, but the real battle, the one for meaning, was only just beginning.